Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Masa podcast number 1, Marine Aquarium Society of Australia. And welcome, number 1. This episode, we will be talking about breeding. So if you are first here, if you stumbled across us by accident in your drunken haze, join the Masa forums to join the chat, and therefore you can join us later on for a question and answer. Now, breeding is something which I tried once in the past, and it was a bit aborted. I got a couple of clownfish that started spawning, and I thought, brilliant. I went out, I got my 65-litre black round tub, I got a heater, I got things which I thought I needed, and then I got a full-time job, and I ran out of time to do breeding. So perhaps I need to talk to someone that knows a bit more about breeding than I do. The person I'm talking to tonight got to number 3 in the highest achieving hobbyist in the world for the Marine Breeding Initiative. He's also the first and only hobbyist breeder worldwide to qualify as successfully breeding 5 species clownfish for the Marine Breeding Initiative. In 5 years of supplying clownfish in Australia, he has raised over 45,000 fish and shrimp. And these are shrimp and fish that have not been taken from the waters or imported. And when you're dealing with imported and captured fish and shrimp, you can be dealing with up to 60% deaths. So getting them in captive breeding is an absolutely amazing attempt. So I'd like to welcome Darren tonight, who is also known as CaptCrash on the Masa forums. So welcome, Darren.
Hi, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
No worries. So first of all, are you actually involved in the marine industry in any way, shape, or form, or is this just purely a hobby?
No, completely just a hobby. So, yeah, just started off with a tank like everyone does, and when it got a bit overboard. So,
and that first tank, was it a marine tank, freshwater tank, something else?
I started with marine. Hadn't had any experience with fish at all. I had some goldfish in a pond outside, but that was about it. So yeah, marine was where I started. Had some stuff like a turtle and stuff when I was growing up, but that's really about it. And that was just straight into marine.
So what was your first tank? Was it off the shelf or DIY? What was it?
It was a second-hand tank that I'd just looked on forums and found a 6x2x2, and just started from there. It was a pretty dodgy setup in hindsight, but it worked for a while and covered the floor in water a few times as well, and then sort of have gone on from there to my current one.
Now, for your tank, what were your first fish in there?
They were clownfish. So a couple of percula clowns and some blue tangs. So yeah, that was the first fish, and then was then a couple of little shrimp, I think, from memory. Yeah.
Now, were any of these critters later used in your breeding attempts?
Yeah, they were. I think the perks definitely were one of the first pairs that I had that laid, and the blue tangs were actually the ones that I had a little bit of publicity about with them spawning as they got older. So that was a couple of years later. Unfortunately, I then had a bit of an issue a couple of years ago with a power outage and actually lost both of those, but they were sort of definitely there for the kicking off of the breeding.
Now, do you remember how much your setup cost you actually?
Oh, the original one was lots of sort of random bits and pieces, and I probably spent somewhere about $6,000 or $8,000 by the time I sort of put it all together. So there was I bought a lot of brand new gear, and a lot of that's actually still going. So that's good. It's all lasted, and sort of probably bought bigger than I needed initially, and in my current tank, it still runs most of it.
And obviously you've invested a lot more since then with a few other tanks and things like that.
Oh yeah, like with that's really just the inside tank, and then my breeding tank setup is all out in my garage. So I've got 54 tanks, I think it is, in total, separated into a batch of different systems. Yeah, we'll go with overboard. Overboard's probably the right word to describe it. And so, but those systems actually aren't too expensive to set up. Mostly it's all just second-handy tanks. And really the cost is in running them. It's probably a few $1,000s worth of new bits. Plumbing, the actual plumbing and piping is actually the most expensive thing really, in terms of setting up a new one. But other than that, it's all good.
Okay, so now obviously you don't need 54 tanks to be able to breed a pair of clownfish.
No, not for one pair of clownfish. So I have of those, what is it, about 24 of them have actually got separate pairs of clowns in them. So I just have one pair per tank. And then the other tanks are for growing up the babies. And then I've actually got a whole series of other little fry tanks as well. For starting off breeding, no, it's probably you probably want 2 tanks or maybe 3 tanks to grow, to initially have your pair, grow some fry, and then have some space for them to grow out into. So yeah.
I suppose having all those tanks explains how you're able to achieve 45,000, well, hopefully soon 54,000 fish, but 45,000 fish.
Yeah, well, that's also over a few years. So it's because some of the species have quite large nests. Like you can it's not too difficult to sort of get 600 or 700 from a batch. Certainly for like the Clarkies and the tomato type clowns, and even for the Perculas or Ocellaris, it's sort of a 300 or 400 is a pretty typical to perhaps even a small nest. So it is pretty quick, pretty easy to actually have some quite large numbers in terms of what you can produce.
Okay, well, we'll get along to that one a bit later, but let's go back in time a bit. What was the first critter you tried breeding in your tanks?
I suppose when I first started, I had just a single tank, which was a 7-foot tank that I'd been given from a fish shop that was closing down, and I just put some petitions in it and had about 3 or 4 pairs in it. And the first ones that I actually got eggs from were some Clarkies. So that was sort of my very first one. And I actually remember the particular day when I found them, I'd been cleaning the tank and actually went to grab the standpipe to sort of turn it around to give it a clean, and it felt weird, and I turned it around and it was just bright orange. So that was my first, oh my God, I've got lots of clownfish eggs. And so that was just excellent. Yep. And then about a month later, I had some Perculas and tomatoes lay as well. So sort of had quite a bit of, probably a year and a half of growing them up and feeding them very well. And then everything just started sort of within about 4 weeks or 5 weeks, they actually started laying. And then fairly quickly after that, I was actually able to raise them.
So what was your success rate with those eggs?
The first few batches, very, very poor. Like, you just kill most of them. Like, you're lucky to get them up past sort of 24 hours or 48 hours. But sort of after a few batches and having a bit of practice, you get to a point where you get a really quite a good success rate. From a large batch, these days I'd probably lose tens of fish, maybe. What you find is once you sort of get into the swing of it and get it all done, you either lose them in the first 24 hours if you're going to lose some, or you sort of have a pretty reasonable run through and don't lose too many. So I think my best batch was about 850 out of a single Clarkie batch. And I think there was about 860 or 865 that hatched. So yeah, you can actually achieve a very, very high percentage, but initially, no, you tend to wipe them out. And
what do you attribute most of the losses to initially?
It's about learning and learning to deal with the fry gently. I think it's certainly part of the problem. When you first sort of get the eggs, you sort of want to have a look at them. So you use a torch and you're shining around them. And if you harass them on the day that they're going to hatch by shining light on them, they'll simply not hatch that night. So they'll stay on the eggs, and then they'll use up their energy. They'll hatch the next night, and then they'll be very poor. Also, trying to collect them. Initially I was trying to scoop them out or siphon them, or and basically just being a bit too rough with them, and so they'd end up being dead the next morning. So after a little while, I did a bit more research and ended up getting some little larval collection traps, which are just a little plastic container that the water flows in one side and then collects in a center section, and they're from a guy in the US called Chad Vossen. And all they literally do is there's just a screen, so a little filter, and it just collects all the fry, and then you can just siphon them straight out of there into the container you're going to grow them up in, and you don't stress them, and that makes certainly a big difference. The other thing some people do is they actually take the eggs out of in my case, I tend to leave the eggs in with the adults right until they hatch and actually let them hatch in the adult tank. Some other people will actually take whatever the eggs are on out of the adult tank and put it into the fry tank that you're going to grow them up in, and that's another way to do it. I found that a little bit too fiddly, so I use the larval traps. Other people sort of use a different approach. Especially with the larval traps, all you basically do is stick it on the inside of the tank, run some air through it, and have a little light near the entrance to the larval trap. And what that will do is attract the fry to the trap. They get sort of sucked in to the trap, and they get collected. So you basically just wait at night, have all the lights off. In my case, it was quite often sort of 10 o'clock-ish. So it's all nice and dark, and then sort of go out there, see that they're hatching, put the trap in, and come back an hour and a half later, and probably 95% of the fry are actually then in a nice little group in the trap. So that works pretty well. Saves a lot of work, and yeah. Sorry.
Definitely. Now, was there any particular stage when you were doing your clownfish breeding where it was just like the aha moment, where you think, yeah, I got it now, that's it?
For the clowns, definitely, as you sort of go through, you find a lot of consistency. So between the process you sort of go through with like the Osiris or Perculas, or even the tomatoes and Clarkies, that it's so very, very similar. So once you've done a few of those, it does definitely sort of become a bit routine, and that way you sort of become very comfortable with it. And that's just some practice, really. But by the same token, some of the other clownfish varieties are a bit more difficult. They take smaller food, and that's still a bit of a challenge today. So even though I've done lots and lots of them, the white stripe and the yellow stripe maroons, and the skunk type clowns are still a bit of a challenge. So yeah.
Now, were there any particular hurdles you had to overcome? As in one of those things where you just realised, this is what's holding me back. This is what I need to fix up before I'm actually going to really break through?
Oh, definitely. Consistency is definitely the biggest issue that I found was once I was reliably doing the same process, that made a big difference. And so working on basically getting that process down and keeping the getting food to them at the right times, keeping the tanks clean, those sorts of things really make the biggest difference. Especially like working my process, one of the big things that I found is like you sort of get to the stage where you can look at the eggs, know whether they're going to hatch tonight or tomorrow night, that sort of thing. And when I'd spot when eggs are going to hatch tomorrow night, and then what I'd do is I'd set up my larvae tanks now and put rotifers in them already. So that gives the rotifers a chance to bloom up with some algae before I introduce the fry. And that just means there's more food when the fry come on. The other thing that probably helped me fairly well when I sort of started off, sort of going from having a few tanks to obviously 54, is some automation. So I put quite a bit of work into making the breeding systems run pretty much on their own and looking after themselves. So that really helped because dealing with that many tanks, it's really easy to just make silly mistakes. And similarly with the fry, the amount of times I've done silly things like leaving airlines not in the tanks, and then you come back the next day and there's 500 dead fry because you forgot to leave just an airline in there. So yeah, that being very consistent with the process that you go through. If you're cleaning the bucket, I would literally put the buckets that had the dirty water in between me and the door, so I had to walk over them to get out the door. Just silly little things like that stop me making silly mistakes. And just getting those processes down, that really is the biggest thing. And then with the automation, making the systems reliable as well, in that making sure the temperature was consistent, the salinity, making sure lighting is another big thing that I'm fairly convinced makes a big difference, in that making sure the lighting schedule is very consistent and reliable. That's something I found when I was manually doing that, or where I'd have little cheapy timers that would drift, that sort of thing. I found I got weird and wonderful results. When I moved over the lighting and the temp control over to my aquarium controller and got very consistent results every day, it definitely seems to make a difference. And then, making sure you feed them well. They're really the biggest things, and making sure like similar amounts of food every day, morning and night, and making sure the adults especially are in very good condition. That's probably the biggest things that are focused on. And the other thing, with the aquarium controller, it obviously let me run more tanks than I would have otherwise been able to deal with myself. Yeah.
Okay, so now you've spoken about the clowns you've bred, and there's actually quite a few of those, but you've not just bred clownfish, you've bred other things as well. So what other things, if it goes in salt water, what have you tried to breed?
Oh, what have I tried, or what have I been successful at? They're two very different things.
Let's start with successful. Okay,
successful. Outside of the clown sort of family, some seahorses. So the WA seahorses. So I had the opportunity to do a couple of batches of those, and they were really great fun. It was something very different. Some Banshee cardinals. I've done quite a few of those actually. Some peppermints, which I've got. I still don't think I'm only up to about probably 40 or 50 that I've actually got through in total. And I'm still not very good with the shrimp. I still always end up with 1s and 2s, and pretty average results. And then dotty backs. Had quite a few dotty backs. Where so I think three species of dotty backs I've been able to get all the way through. So yeah. And then some other weird and wonderfuls that I haven't been successful with, but has been great fun. So I've had the opportunity to do some redline and blood shrimp. I still haven't been able to achieve them all the way through, which is annoying. But I keep sort of getting to 60 or 80 days, and then they will die off. Then the other one that was really good fun that I didn't get very far, but I want to go back to doing again is octopus. Had the opportunity to do some Sydney octopus, and so they were excellent. They were really good fun to play with, and got them to hatch and kept them alive for a couple of weeks. But that was about it. Yeah.
Okay, and so I'm obviously leading from this. There's also the fact that breeding shrimp and breeding fish are two different kettle of fish.
Oh yeah, they're very, very different. In some, it's funny. In some ways, the shrimp are easier in that it's a simpler feeding process. But you've got much smaller critters that are a little bit more difficult to look after, and it's a bit more important that you sort of keep your water a bit cleaner, that sort of thing. The fish, on the other side, it's your focus is on trying to grow them quickly and get them onto easier to handle food items. So with the clowns and the dotty backs, that sort of thing, you definitely start off with very small food, so rotifers or copepods, and then move them up to artemia or brine shrimp, and then finally onto pellets or powder first, and then pellets as quickly as you can. So in my case, I sort of generally try and focus on as quickly as possible getting those fish off of the live foods, so the rotifers and the artemia, and onto pellets, because then I could use feeders and automate that feeding process, and you get a lot more. The fish end up with a lot more energy out of the pelleted food than they do out of artemia, for example, or rotifers. And with the shrimp, it's very much more about artemia is the sort of primary food most of the time, and so that's morning and night putting in buckets of artemia or brine shrimp into the shrimp and trying to get them to grow up. Yeah.
Now you obviously you haven't always been successful, but there was one particular fish which you put a bit of effort into trying to breed, and you got quite a bit of attention for this. And this was your attempt to breed the regal tang. So
Yes.
first, so tell us a bit about your attempts, and we'll ask questions from after your story.
All right. Well, the regal tangs or blue tangs or whatever you want to call them, they were actually one of the first pairs of fish that I had in my tank. So they were from literally the very first day that I put fish in. So when I got them, they were I'm going to say 1.5 inches, 2 inches long, and grew them up for obviously quite a long time. And once they got to about 8 or 10 inches, they started to spawn. And I'd started doing some clown breeding by then, so I was pretty convinced that they were spawning. Their behaviour was sort of around the same sort of thing that I'd read about them doing. In the wild, they'll actually come in as a school, and then they'll sort of dart away from the school up towards the surface, spawn, and then spawn into the water column. Mine was sort of doing that behaviour, but instead of darting upwards, they were actually going sort of end to end of the tank and swimming in circles, getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And then then you'd have a big splash and a big cloud of what looked like bubbles. And so I this particular night when they'd done it, I decided, oh, I'm going to actually have a bit more of a look, and had a bit more of a look, and was pretty convinced that yes, I'd had eggs, and then took some photos and posted them up, and yeah, got quite a bit of that interest. So then decided I put a little bit of effort in to see just how far I could go and what I could do. So yeah, basically did for probably about 2 years, 2.5 years. I would every few days collect some eggs, put them in some containers, and then try different ways of raising the resulting pro larva. And some of those things would, they would die off very, very quickly, and in some ways they'd last for a bit longer. So I was able to pretty quickly work out that the starvation period for a brand new hatched blue tang pro larva is about 6 to 7 days, somewhere in that sort of space, and is quite dependent on the amount of temperature and light that occurs in that time as well. If you overheat the water, they'll die off very quickly. If you have a lot of movement in the water, they'll die off very quickly. If the container is too small, they'll run into the edges and they'll die off very quickly. There's quite a lot of dying off very quickly. Yeah, just over time, started trying different food items and trying to work out what they would be able to eat as their first food, because they're very, very small. The eggs are about 0.4 of a millimeter in diameter, and they're transparent, so they're tiny. When the pro larva hatch, they're nearly a millimeter long, somewhere in that sort of space, and they're again transparent. So the mouth on the pro larva is about 0.1 of a millimeter across. So you're looking for foods that are much smaller than rotifers for them to be able to eat. And that's really where my first sort of challenge was trying to find something that I could feed to them, and for it to be nutritious for them to grow. And that still is the problem today. So I suppose my ability to go out and grow very, very small food items is sort of, that's really the limitation of where I'm at. So what I ended up doing was sort of deciding, well, if I can't grow it, what I'll do is I'll go and collect wild plankton, and then just simply collect the very, very small plankton items. So I started in a process where I'd every 3 days go to the beach in the middle of, well, sort of 10, 11 o'clock at night with a torch, some buckets, sink the buckets in the sea, shine lights into them, and then simply wait for 10 or 15 minutes, and then come back, get the buckets, run them through some screens to screen out anything larger, and keep everything that was smaller than 100 microns, sorry, 75 microns, and was bigger than 50 microns. So that was sort of my target, and just had some couple of big screens that would sit over some buckets. So that made it nice and easy. And then, yeah, collect that food, and that was what I then started feeding to the pro larva. And using that, I was able to keep them alive for quite long periods. It became pretty easy to keep them alive for sort of 20 to 30 days. And a couple of batches, I think I had about 60, 65 days in that sort of space. But it was very, very dependent on so I could keep them alive for quite a long time in the spring, summer type time period. But through winter and when it was, basically when it's colder, I'd be lucky to get to 14 days. So very much about just sort of, I don't really have the capability to identify what they were eating. I was just going to, just going with the, if I can't figure it out, I'm just going to go with everything. The downside with that process, however, is every 3 days going to the beach in the middle of the night, standing in dark water with a torch on your head, you get some weird looks. It's also not the most comfortable process, so it gets a bit, it gets a bit old really quick. So yeah, if I could have worked with a university close or something like that who breeds these sorts of critters, in terms of the various food items, that would probably assist a lot. I actually got a little bit of help from the James Cook University in Townsville. A couple of the PhD students there were really kind and sent me over some different types of copepods to try, and actually did provide a bit of assistance, but it always ended up being simply much too large in terms of first foods. So yeah, the net result is I can basically keep the pro larva alive, but they don't really flourish. So they don't really grow. They just stay little, and they don't transition into being a fish. They're still, very, very delicate. In fact, so delicate that I often just use just large takeaway container type plastic containers for them to be in. And if you came up and happened to bump the table that they were on, you could literally watch them fall out of the water, and they'd just sort of float down to the bottom dead. They're very, very sensitive, and that's around not enough nutrients. Sort of just keeping them alive, and that's really about it.
So it must be a very fine line to walk. Obviously, if you've got a small container, you don't need as much food to be able to feed them. But if you have two larger containers, so where bumping the table won't kill them, you're going to need a lot more food than what you had. So.
Yeah, and once you go from once you know what to feed them, yes, those big containers probably make a lot more sense. I actually had I had some assistance from Aquarium a couple of times where we took some batches of eggs to his house and actually tried using a big container where we'd gone and got seawater, left it out in the sun, so we got lots of random algae just go berserk in it, and backwashed a heap of again, random copepod or random planktony type critters into it. On the trial of let's try some bigger environments and that sort of thing. But again, they fairly quickly they fell over in that as well. So yeah, it's a lot more work would really need to go into to get further on with the blue tangs. So on the plus side, from the yellow tang space, the guys in Hawaii from the Hawaii Oceanographic Institute have now had quite a few batches of yellow tangs through now, and their first ones are literally just coming up to the size where they're actually going to start coming into the market. So that's the very first of the tangs ever to be bred in captivity. So there's some good hope that people will be able to repeat that process with other tang species. But it is very, very much an academic or university type project with lots of people working on the whole breeding thing. Yeah.
Now, we've talked about probably one of the hardest fish to breed. So let's now talk to the people that may be listening thinking, do I want to really get into breeding if it's this catastrophic? So what would you actually say is the easiest to breed if you're a beginner?
I would definitely go with the clownfish or Banji cardinals are probably the two most straightforward fish to start with. Mostly because there's just simply so much information available. I quite like the larger clowns. I find them very, very easy to breed. So the tomatoes and the clarkies. The downside with those, however, is actually selling them on after you've raised them is a bit harder because the demand isn't as high as, for example, for the perculas or the ocellaruses. And again, with the Bangies, so the Bangi cardinals, yeah, that's another really good starter sort of fish in terms of breeding because it's a very simple process. So I'll probably to I suppose give everyone a bit of an idea of what the process is of getting the fish from when they hatch to getting them to a size where they can go into a tank with other fish. For the Bangi cardinals, that's actually really, really straightforward, where you simply have your adult pair, they'll mate, the female will give the eggs to the male who actually will hold them in his mouth. And he'll hold them in his mouth for about 20, 21 days, something like that. Which I'm not 100% on that. Yeah, it's about that sort of time. And then what he'll actually do is the eggs will hatch in his mouth and he'll actually release fully formed little fish out into the tank. At that point, it's just a matter of collecting the little baby fry, putting them in a separate tank is the easiest, and then starting to feed them lots of Artemia and keeping them well fed at that point. And you just literally keep feeding them Artemia and let them grow up a bit. I have always been very focused on I'll feed them Artemia until I can get them onto pellets, and then as soon as I can get them onto pellets, I'll stop feeding them Artemia because they will grow a lot quicker. And also, when you're just feeding fish Artemia, you often get some issues where they won't deal with fright very well. I don't understand why particularly, but it seems to be common with the Bangies and also also the clownfish as well. So Bangi is definitely very straightforward there. Clownfish are a little bit harder in that you really need a couple of starter foods. So your first starter food is rotifers. And they're just a very, very small crustacean. And so what you do there is put some rotifers in with the clownfish when they're first hatched. They'll start eating about 24 hours after they've hatched. And then for the next 3 or 4 days, keep lots of rotifers in. As they grow, then start introducing Artemia and keep the Artemia in with them and basically try and get them off of the rotifers onto just eating Artemia. In that case, I just used the newly hatched Artemia. So I actually hatch it morning and night, and will then put the Artemia in and make sure there's a density in the water so that there's always food available for the fish. You don't want to go overboard and have massive amounts of food for them, but you don't want them to actually go for a period without having food either. So you want to get them to grow as quickly as you can and have a good energy store, because what they'll do after about 10 days, 10, 12 days, depending on the species, is they'll go through a meta process. So they'll go from being a fry into a very small fish. And they'll actually, almost overnight, they'll go from being pretty clear with little bits of colour into it to actually looking like just a small clownfish. And so they'll sort of take on typically they'll take on the orange colour pretty much straight away. They just won't have any lines or anything like that through them as yet. And then, so once you get to meta, which is sort of, it takes them a lot of energy, so it's often a time where you will lose some. And then after meta, as quickly as I can, get them off of brine shrimp and into taking pellets. So that's sort of your steps through, and it tends to be 3 or 4 days on rotifers, up to about day 10 to day 12 on Artemia, and then as quickly as possible after that, getting them onto pellets. And in terms of pellets, I just use whatever pellets I'm feeding the adults, and I just crush them. So I run them through a salt mill to actually make different sized, anything from dust right through to sort of half the size of pellets, so that I've got a range of foods as the fish are growing, that they're getting some good nutrition. The other one that's actually pretty straightforward in terms of breeding is seahorses. They're obviously
there, mate. It's time to break up a bit.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yep, you're back now.
Yep.
So, try it again.
Okay. So yeah, seahorses are another one that are they're actually, obviously you've got to have your adults in good condition, but once they release they'll mate. The male will look after them in his pouch, and then he'll release them. And once they're released, they're basically little seahorses ready to go. So once again, it's a case of collect all your seahorses up, feed them Artemia. With seahorses, it's very important to not overfeed them. So if you treat them a bit like a Banji cardinal or the clownfish, where you put in lots of Artemia, with the seahorses, unfortunately, what they'll do is they'll keep eating the new Artemia, and they won't dissolve the nutrition out of the Artemia that they've already eaten, and basically they'll just sort of push it through, and it will come out the other end, and they won't have got much nutrient from it. So it's actually very important with those guys to actually back off your feeding and sort of give them batches of food and give them enough time to digest. Otherwise, they keep eating and they don't do very well. But yeah, so they're probably I think the three easiest ones to start with, and definitely with the clowns, which is sort of probably the more complex of the three, but the most common. The bigger clowns are definitely easier to breed. And so if it's a sort of thing where you've got an interest in doing it, definitely the ones to look at would be the tomato varieties and the Clarkie varieties. They're a bigger fry, they eat very well, they grow quite quickly, and so they're a bit more forgiving when you make mistakes early on. And as an extra bonus, they have much larger nests, so you get more fry to practice on. So that's always helpful and makes it easier to be successful.
Okay, so what was the most satisfying creature you've bred in captivity, or most satisfying, as in if you want to mention multiple of them?
Definitely the blue tangs. I think are definitely, I suppose, one of the effort of going through. It would obviously be better if I'd been able to get further through. But I think it's really, I often find, like, I'm not really sure what I would say. There's not really been a particular species where it's been something outstanding. It's always been when I I work on the next task. So where I sort of started with the Clarkies and the tomatoes and the perks and stuff, and then have gone out into the other species of clown. That's sort of always been the next satisfying thing. When I look back on it, definitely I've got a very big soft spot for the Clarkies. I really enjoyed those. The first ones I got all the way through, and that was very good for me. And the octopus was another one that I thought was just absolutely excellent to do. They were really, really good fun. They were really interesting, and they were very, very different from what I'd done before.
Okay, cool. Now, important question. Are you still breeding at the moment?
No, not at the moment. So we're actually looking to move house in the next couple of months, hopefully. So I've sort of taken the opportunity to shut it all down at the moment. So yeah, not so much breeding at the moment. I've still got a few pairs, and I'm sort of actively selling those off as I can make them go away, so that the whole process of moving is a little bit better. Because trying to move a a double garage full of tanks is not. It doesn't seem like it's going to be a fun choice. So
Wouldn't that be fun with the removalists? Yeah, I need to move 54 tanks. Keep the fire alive, please.
Yes. Yeah. No. So they're all going away for the moment, and it'll give me a time to have a bit of a break. It's been sort of 5 or 6 years of really not like any time I've gone away, something disastrous has happened. Yeah, I'm looking forward to having being able to go away for a week and not have to harass everyone to come look after my fish.
Fair enough. Now, obviously, you sound like you're going to be returning. Did you have any big plans for your return? Were there any particular marine critters that you were going to aim for in your comeback specials?
Well, I'm not 100% that I'm coming back, but I'd say there's probably a pretty good chance that I'll give it another go after a bit of a break. But I think definitely the shrimp is something that I really want to get further along with. I'd like to, really just achieve a bit more on the blood shrimp and the red line shrimp and even the peppermint shrimp. And there's a lot of other sort of interesting shrimp. At the moment, I've got some, I've just forgotten their names. The fancy little shrimp that eat starfish. So that's, they're interesting. Then the other things I'd like to have more of a go at is do some more work with mandarins. I've had some success there in the past, but not a lot. And I didn't actually manage to get all the way through the mandarins, and I'd like to do some more work with mandarins, and especially the WA mandarin. If I can get some more pairs of those in the future, that'd be very excellent. And then obviously the blue tangs, if I can get to a point where I can come back, that'd be great. Someone has just put in the post that harlequin shrimp is the word I'm looking for, and that's in fact exactly what the fancy shrimp that eat starfish. They are excellent. And the other one that I'd really like to do actually is the blue-green chromis. There's a couple of people in the world that have done them, but they don't get a lot of focus because they get sold very cheaply. But on the other side, they get sold in massive numbers. Something like about a third of the marine fish that come into Australia are blue-green chromis by number. They come in massive volumes. And that's another one where being able to find a way to raise them in a way that works and could reduce the sheer volume of them coming off reefs. I think that would be something else I'd really like to work on in the future. And then the other one that I would really like to have a better go at is the octopus. There's not too many people that have raised. Certainly, I'm not aware of anyone that's raised the Sydney octopuses. But I think it would be a really good fun exercise to go through again and see how far I can get.
Okay, well, what we'll do is we're going to start taking questions from people, so you can answer it in a moment. But in the meantime, I suppose I should do the Masa announcement. So people, if you've got questions, start typing them up, and I'll keep an eye on chat. And I'll talk about what's going on around Australia with Masa. So let's start off with Victoria. They have got their monthly meeting on the 1st of May. So yeah, that's going to be happening this Sunday. Their theme this month is going to be photography. So dust off your cameras and bring them along. If you want to know details, jump on the forums and ask in the Masa website, find a Masa committee member or member and ask them for the details. They will also be going to a house where the host runs a ZeoVit system. So if you keep on hearing the phrase ZeoVit and wonder what it means and what's involved, come along, ask questions. The meeting starts at 12 p.m. This is open to members and guests. So if you are not a Masa member, does not matter. join up the Masa forums and ask someone along. Now, Queensland, specifically Brisbane, you have got a frag day coming up. You'll be meeting at Atlas Aquarium Marine on the 14th of May. Well, I say will be if you go. And it's Saturday. It goes from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. On the day, there'll be demonstrations where you'll be able to see all sorts of fascinating images which you just can't see with your naked eyes. You use microscopes, so you'll be looking into the microscopic world of the marine tank, where you'll be looking at marine fish-related bacteria and their diseases. So you can find out what's killing your fish, hopefully not killing your fish. We'll also be looking at some of the latest fragging equipment, and there'll be demonstrations from professionals on the day. Members and guests will be welcome. So this is at Atlas Aquarium Marine on the 14th of May from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. If you are a member, you'll be eligible to win prizes. There'll be door prizes and free frags giveaway. If you're not a member and this sounds good, maybe you want to join the MASQ today. The Orphan Group, also known as pretty much not any of the big ones, in Adelaide, there's going to be a tank crawl. This is a members only tank crawl. So you'll be going from house to house, seeing other people's tanks, asking them questions about their tanks. If this sounds interesting to you and you're not a member, you might want to join up the MASOG today to be able to join in, and then go to the MASOG forums to get the details. Oh, hang on, my phone. And my thing just said mute on for a second, and that fun. Canberra, this is where I'm from, hooray. There will be a meet at Canberra Marine. This will be a chance to catch up with other reefers and see the amazing stock at Canberra Marine. This will be on the 14th of May at midday. If you want to know where they are, you can either jump on the Masa forums and ask there, or you can look for Canberra Marine on Facebook and find them there. There was no announcements from Mass Sydney sent to me in time, so unfortunately I don't know if they're doing anything, but that doesn't mean they're not. Make sure you check the Masa event pages, and if you're a member of MASF, check your forums. Western Australia, nothing announced to me either, but if you are not a member, MASWA do give you a couple of weeks free membership if you want to try it out and see what's involved. So if you join up the forums and you're in Western Australia, send a committee member a message and let them know you're interested, and they'll join you up for a little while so you can see what's involved, and hopefully you love it and you want to join in. So that is the announcements. So let's have a quick look back at what we've got. So we've got the question of, first of all, how did you find selling juvies? Did you get good prices? Do you have to sell in bulk, smaller batches? Or do you manage to break even, or do you turn a profit?
Oh, okay, that's always the fun one. Overall, I would say I would doubt that I made a profit on the whole process, simply because with the number of tanks I run, the monthly power costs are pretty harsh, and so that definitely eats into the to what you can return from it. When I was doing very large batches, I actually partnered up with someone locally. So I was doing the initial adults, growing up the fry, and once the fish got to about a month old, I would then hand them off to my partner, who would do the actual grow out for me. When we were doing that, we were selling around 3,000 to 3,500 fish a month, and that was certainly worthwhile. So in terms of pricing, it very much depends on volume and how flexible you are. So I sold predominantly, in terms of volume, I sold predominantly through a distributor, and that was good in that I could sell very large batches, sort of 3,000 to 5,000 fish at a time, and so that made that process very simple. Locally, I would then sell directly to the local fish shops. I got a little bit more for selling to the local fish shops. Generally, you can sort of think probably somewhere in the order of about quarter to a third of the retail price, somewhere in that sort of space. It's a little bit less than that. Yeah, sort of if something's selling for say $35, I'd probably get $5 to $8 somewhere in that space. But again, depending on quantities. If a fish shop wants 10 fish, then sort of going to be more at sort of the $8 to $10 per fish mark. If they're going to buy 100 at a time, then no, it's probably more down on the $6 or $7 mark. And for the distributors, it's more like $4 or $5. But volume is very different there, and even the amount of effort. Doing a batch of say 3,000 fish to a distributor, they supply all the containers, they supply the bags, literally everything bar me taking water, putting it in the bag, and then sending it off. So, that sort of, I suppose, gives you an idea. It's the sort of thing where if you probably have to do it, I'm guessing maybe twice the size of what I'm doing to be able to do it as a business, and then you really start being in an issue where you've got to be really pumping them through. Now, in terms of the actual pricing, no, I actually think one of the problems is there's not a lot of differentiation in Australia between wild caught fish and captive bred fish. In fact, a lot of the fish shops will actually talk down the captive bred fish as though they're going to be less colourful. Now, that is a risk with some of the captive bred fish. If you really try and push your fish through to grow them very quickly, you can often get very poor markings, not good colour in them, and that's all around nutrition into the fish. So if your focus is on just pumping out big numbers of fish, that's definitely something that you've got to be wary of. And the downside is from some of the fish shops is you get this feedback of, oh no, we want them to be cheaper, and they're very focused on making them cheaper. So you do have to work a little bit on making sure you try and push your prices higher. To do it as a business, I don't think it's practical at those sort of prices. You've really got to push probably to do volumes more up in the sort of $8 to $10 in larger volumes, which you're not going to get through the distributors. They're just simply not going to pay it. They'll bring them in from overseas. So you need to find a medium ground that's good. In my case, I found the distributors would actually take good quantities of clarkies and tomatoes, the rubicinctuses, and they were all species that do have very large nests. So it means you sort of have one lot of effort and you get 700 or 800 fish out of it. And if you're doing that, you've only really got to do one batch a month, or one batch every 2 months probably. And that is a very good basis for then adding other fish in and making it profitable overall.
Yep. Okay. Now, another question that has been asked is designer fish and designer clowns. Do you think they're a good thing for the industry, or have you even accidentally ended up with any of the designer clownfish from a bit of cross-spawning or anything like that?
I haven't actually achieved any. I'm not very focused on the whole designer thing, to be quite honest. I like them for what they are, I suppose. I do have some designing pairs where, just obviously it's sort of a demand and supply thing. I don't know. The whole crossbreeding thing is not something I've done a lot of work with, so it's not really something I'm particularly focused on. On the other side, I do like the more unusual clowns. So it's, I suppose, an extension of that. Yeah. So I haven't really answered the question.
You haven't, but I suppose that just means you also haven't looked into it, so you can't give the full-on industry answer.
Yep.
Okay, well, that's fair enough. We can't twist your arm on that one, because I'm in Canberra and you're in Perth. I suppose a question from me is how important is the diet of the parent fish for your larvae?
I think it's critical. At the end of the day, you've got, and especially for the female, she, in the case of clownfish, they're pushing out 500 to 1,000.
Mate.
Sorry.
Break up. Yep.
Is that clear?
I know. Yep.
Every sort of 14 days or so, they're having 500 to 1,000 eggs. So having good quality nutrition going into them, and in my case, I would make my own foods. So my process for feeding was I would give the adults pellets morning and night, and then 10 minutes later, I would basically, after they'd had a chance to have some pellets, I would then give them some mash, which was just a frozen mash that I made up. Now, that was fairly heavy in terms of, I actually used octopus and squid in it, and quite a bit of shellfish. So they would actually, whenever I'd go to the local fishmongers and get fish, they'd always want to know, was I having a party or something? And then there'd be the inevitable, no, these are for my fish. At which point they'd all be like, oh my God. So yes, they definitely ate very well. They got prawns, everything in, mashed up, and then basically packed into little freezer bags, nice and flat, so I could just break off little pieces, and the fish would then get some mash 10 minutes after their pellets, morning and night. So they'd get 2 lots of food at least twice a day. After the first couple of years, it got a bit old having to feed morning and night. So I actually ended up building an automated feeding system, which ran a bit like a flying fox that runs up and down over the tanks and would actually feed the pellets automatically. And that was simply because going out and buying 50 feeders was horribly expensive. And then you'd get things like the batteries corroding, and it just wasn't very practical, in a quantity thing. So I built some larger feeders that would go and feed the batches of tanks. And that was another thing that, again, let me run lots more tanks than I would otherwise be able to do sensibly myself.
Gunter has just asked kind of a relevant question for that. So equipment failures. Now, we know about your power outage, which was kind of a disastrous one, but that wasn't really an equipment failure. But what sort of losses did you get in equipment? So heaters, power supplies, power heads, things like that.
I'm a very, very big believer in redundancy, and I'll punch as much redundancy into anything I can. So, for example, heaters in each of the systems that are still running now. So one has 4 heaters in it, another one has 5 heaters in it, and the other one has 3 heaters in it. So they can probably all run on a single heater each, but each of the heaters, I've got, so I run 4 circuits in my garage, so 4 power circuits. The heaters are run from separate circuits. The return pumps, so in each of the main systems I have 2 major return pumps, which run up and run a loop around all the tanks. Very much go with use more than you need and allow for some failure. They're all run from my aquarium controller, which monitors, so the heaters, for example, will be set a couple of degrees above the target temperature, and the aquarium controller will cut power to them at whatever the target temperature is. So that if I have a heater that locks on and just continues to heat, the aquarium controller will shut it down. If the aquarium controller fails, then I've got the power boards actually go into a standby mode, so that in that case, they will rely on the heater. So the the power boards are all set so that if the controller shuts down and doesn't respond, then they'll have a default setting. So that very much about, if something goes horribly wrong. And then separate to all of that, there is a loop of air line that runs around the entire garage, which supplies air to all the tanks, a bit like a freshwater setup. And all that is about is if there's a power outage, that the 2 air pumps will keep running. There's 2 separate UPSs and they're on 2 of the circuits. So there's a separate UPS that just runs each air pump, and then they then run on a loop that supplies air to every tank. So that if I do have a power outage or something like that, I've got some protection. What that didn't save me from is I actually had an issue where I had a break-in and someone turned off all my power, and I actually lost a heap of pairs in that. That was 4 or 5 years ago now. So that was very, very disappointing.
Wonder whether it was a case of they saw all the lights and all the power and lights and going, aha, we found a grow house, and they got in there and got disappointed in it.
yeah. So yeah, that's probably the biggest issue I've had. It's in both cases where I've had big issues. One was in my inside tank where the power, I was on holidays, and poor guy that was looking after it for me came over to check on it and found everything dead in the inside tank. The outside was all fine. It was just the circuit for the house that went off. And then I had an issue with someone actually physically flicking the switches in the garage, which was odd. But yeah.
Okay.
So redundancy definitely. As soon as you've got pairs, like I've got some pairs that are just simply irreplaceable, and so yeah, very much trying to make it as hopefully I don't screw it.
Fair enough. Now, water for your tanks. Natural salt water, do you get it from the beaches? Do you mix up your own salt mixes? Have you tried mixing and matching? Have you had more successes with one or the other?
Initially, I started with artificial salt water, and I did that on the basis of trying to make sure that I knew exactly what was going into the tanks, and to make sure I didn't have pests of any sort in the tank. So that worked okay when I had a few tanks. Sort of, once I sort of got to the maybe the first batch of rack of tanks that I had, which was 10 2-foot tanks. Then that was that sort of started to get too much of a problem where I was going through maybe about 600 to 800 litres of salt water a fortnight. And so that just simply got to the point where it was just too hard, and I switched over to using natural seawater. So I just got a big 2,000 litre tank, and then one of the local guys that does deliveries comes and drops off about 4,000 litres at a go, 4,500 litres, and that's a much more straightforward process than having to make it up. So yeah, transitioned over, and quite happy with it since. So
you wouldn't actually say one's better than the other. It was just more of a convenience thing.
Definitely a convenience thing. I think because of the amount of water I'm using, it's simpler and easier to manage the salinity with the natural seawater. And again, I've spent a bit of time making the aquarium controller deal with a lot of that. So what happens with my aquarium controller is it has 2 reservoirs, one salt and one fresh water. And as I take water out, it puts back in the appropriate water to keep the salinity at its target. So that makes the whole process much more simple. And even when I do big changes, I simply run a 19 mil hose of RO water in at the same time whilst I do the salt water change, and that comes in through a 35 mil hose. So basically put those in and then just short fill it a little bit and let the aquarium controller deal with matching the salinity accurately.
Fair enough. Okay, now there's one last question here. We'll make this the last question of the night. Frozen foods. Now, have you ever tried anything over rotties, so microplankton or anything like that, or have you just found something that worked? Or
yeah, for the rotifers, I initially started off with live algae, and that definitely is, you do get a better result with live algae for the rotifers, but the amount of effort for it is just not justifiable, in my opinion. So I was growing Tet and Nano, and that would take up nearly as much time as looking after the fry, and it was just couldn't keep doing it. So I switched over to using the Reed's concentrated algae. So they come frozen, which means obviously long freezer life, which is excellent. They're a bit on the expensive side, but the amount of effort it saves is well worth it. And certainly for the clowns, which is primarily what I use the rotifers for, that's perfectly fine. For some more, whenever I'm trying to do something with copepods, then I'll go back and grow some live algae. But unless I've got that need, I just use the frozen stuff, and that works fine for both the L size rotifers and the SS size rotifers, which are the slightly smaller ones, well, substantially small ones. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think it's time to wrap up now. Thank you for coming on the show. It's been absolutely fantastic. As far as a first live webcast goes, I think it was okay, just reasonably okay. So I hope to see you some more on the forum. So this is the Masa podcast, end of number 1. If you enjoyed this show, join us on the forums. If you've got any more questions, definitely shoot the Masa forums. You can find us at www.masa.asn.au and go to the forums. And from there, join up and ask your questions. And if you're already a member, you can already ask your questions, can't you? Thank you for coming along. Thank you for listening, and good night, everyone.